From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, consider this with Kathy Wyatt, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Well, I grew up in a segregated South, and I saw the ravages of racial discrimination and violation of human rights. So when I became governor, I announced in my inaugural address that the time for racial discrimination was over in Georgia. As president, I announced that human rights would be a foundation stone of our entire foreign policy.
And to help shape a just and peaceful world that is truly humane.
When we left the White House, we thought that we would try to devise a system to promote peace and human rights and to address the problems of physical suffering or deprivation of liberty or freedom. And it was that cause that made us evolve the Carter Center over a number of years. Morality and honesty and integrity and peace and justice and respect for human rights, to enhance the prospects of peace and to remove the blight of war and the threat of war would be the overwhelming dream that I would have. I still believe it is possible in the future.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 28th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter. Amanda Brewer and Mary Lopez of Habitat for Humanity of Omaha will address his legacy later in this program. Amanda is the organization's CEO. Mary is a volunteer who worked on 2 builds with the Carters. We begin with his life and 2 guests who can highlight the former president's accomplishments and attributes. They are Preston Love Jr., CEO of Black Votes Matter, and Randy Atkins, professor of political science at UNO. Thank you both so much for being here and welcome.
Happy to come. Thank you.
Preston, I want to start with you. President Jimmy Carter, in his own words, we just heard that. Who was he in yours?
He was, in my mind and in my words, he was the same thing that was in his mind and in his words. He was a man of great, lofty goals, but he was very much underestimated and disrespected for those lofty goals. There were people who actually laughed and said unkind things about him, pushed back against the idea of humanity and peace. Mm-hmm. And so my words for him is congratulations and you pat you on the back, Jimmy Carter, from the very beginning as governor and all the way through his presidency. Mm-hmm. He said what he meant, and quite frankly, in analysis, he did a lot of what he tried to do, in spite of it not being taken seriously by his peers in America in the abstract.
He favored racial tolerance and integration. Those were feelings that initially he kept to himself because he didn't want to make any enemies. I want to ask you, Preston, when and maybe how did that change?
Well, it changed when he had more of a lofty platform, but he says he kept it to himself. I think he did not. Yeah. I think he kept it to himself in the public dialogue, because when he began to make these pronouncements, such as the tape indicated, he received immediate pushback or disrespect for that. It is as if it were another dimension, and it didn't have anything to do with politics and running a state or running the country. How unfortunate that analysis was. And so he changed only because I think to some degree he was an idealistic man and had hope for the best. And I think he changed when the realities were, if you stay like that, you're not going to get any of that done.
Yeah, okay. Randy, after serving in the Georgia State Senate, he went on to run for governor twice.
Yeah.
What's important to note about that?
Well, I think probably the most important thing to note is coming from Plains, Georgia, he wasn't even really well known in his own state. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That's not a very well populated part of Georgia. It's not anywhere near Atlanta. It's actually closer to Florida than it is to Atlanta. He came in third in the Democratic primary the first time he ran, and he really probably ended up dividing the vote and causing a segregationist, Lester Maddox, to get elected governor of Georgia, and that was probably the worst thing that could have possibly happened. So in the meantime, after he loses, he goes back to farming. He goes back to planning his next campaign because he's going to run again. He's already had that first test of politics, and he's ready to do it. And that was the point when he declared that he was a born-again Christian, was between those two campaigns. And anyway, the planning resulted in his running a more modern gubernatorial campaign in 1970, and where he relied on polling and statistical analysis, and some of those things that he did helped pave the path for him in 1976.
I was going to say a run for the White House, of course, to follow, narrowly beating his opponent, Gerald Ford, who would later become his friend. What was the political climate like in 1976?
Well, I think we have to remember that, we had just gone through Watergate. So Nixon has resigned, first president ever to resign. He's resigned in disgrace. And then there's the question of, was there a quid pro quo because Ford pardoned him exactly 30 days later? Now, I think Ford's convinced everybody did convince everybody over time that that wasn't a quid pro quo. He did it to heal the nation, and he actually wrote his memoirs and called it A Time to Heal. But that allowed Carter to benefit in 1976 by being the outside candidate. It was like Nixon and Ford were the insiders, Carter is the outsider, and then he does something that's really different in politics at the time. He decides right after the midterms in 1974 that he's running for president. So in December, he starts traveling to Iowa and traveling to New Hampshire. There were 16 Democratic candidates running in 1976, and he emerges from that field. He wins Iowa, he wins New Hampshire, and those become stepping stones for him to win later states.
Okay.
And so, and a strategy that nobody's really been able to replicate since then. But I just often ask my students, does anybody know who the last governor of Georgia was? And that's how unknown Jimmy Carter was at the time.
Wow. All right, so once elected, he's in there, he pardons the draft dodgers from the Vietnam War. How popular was that?
Oh, it's not popular. I mean, Truman had pardoned about 1,500 people who had not served in World War II. Ford had actually pardoned the draft evaders if they gave 2 years of public service, and that applied to a few thousand people. But Carter's pardon applied to hundreds of thousands of people. Barry Goldwater said it was, in his opinion, the most disgraceful thing a president had ever done. And it wasn't even popular with the anti-war groups because he had not pardoned the deserters. He had just pardoned those who evaded the draft. And so, some people felt he hadn't gone far enough. So it wasn't very popular at the time. But if we look back historically, the pardon power is used because there are times when a pardon can be used to heal the country.
Okay. Second year brings Egypt and Israel together at Camp David. What would you say about that? How would you briefly sum that up in terms of significance?
Yeah, well, so the Camp David Accords, 12 days, intense negotiation. Sadat and Begin wanted to leave, and it's Carter's tenacity that keeps them at the table. It's Carter's work on the project, his knowledge of what is going on. He developed a mastery of the subject, and out of that, even in spite of the fact that they had originally wanted to scrap the negotiations, we end the war between Israel and Egypt, and Egypt recognizes Israel as a state. And now, there are a lot of things that happened after that, including Sadat being assassinated. So it wasn't popular in parts of the Middle East, but it was a big first step for peace in the Middle East.
All right, third year, Russia invades Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
And he boycotts the Olympics, which were to take place in Moscow. Very controversial, especially in a campaign year, right?
Yeah, the things that I would also mention. I mean, the Olympics we remember because we didn't get to participate, and some Olympians have talked about that. But Nebraska was affected by it because of the grain embargo. We ended up tabling the SALT II talks. We ended up. He requested a 5% increase in defense spending because of what was going on in the world, and he pledged support for Pakistan and the U.S. protection of the Persian Gulf all at the same time. So that event really transformed his presidency quite a bit, and he had to think about a lot of different things that he wasn't planning on thinking about at the beginning of his presidency.
Preston, he brought it up in terms of the impact on Nebraska. We've done some high-level stuff here. Let's drill down a little bit. What was going on in Nebraska when Carter was president?
Well, I surely want to transition to that. I just want to reference part of the history that Randy laid out so well. I look at that history and much of my perspective from an African American standpoint. I want to just interject many of the things I could interject in that scenario. But President Carter had made the first African American ambassador to the UN in the midst of that complex world. And that needs to be noted. It also could be noted that he had to fire him later on, and that is a whole nother story. But in Nebraska, I think in spite of the complex and very volatile world that we were living in then, in the African American community, a lot of what was going on was a reflection of not just his presidency, but his role in a very volatile racial country. We were reacting to so many things. As I just think about it here in Nebraska, we had reacting to the assassination of Vivian Strong, 14-year-old girl in the black community who was shot by police and never adjudicated. We had the death of Martin Luther King that affected us here in Nebraska as well. We had some reaction by the community in terms of civil disobedience. There was Ed Poindexter and David Rice, who were accused and sentenced to life for killing a policeman in a bombing. They were Black Panthers. Many of us think that they were gay. But my point is, the community was reacting to a country and world that they felt was hostile. Jimmy Carter offered a ray of hope to the African Americans. That was a big part of what he meant. His administration was more integrated than ever before in the history, and all of that. Andrew Young was part of that, and so what was going on in Nebraska is we were faced with this dichotomy of the realities of things during his presidency, yet the hope that he provided because of his outreach, his what would be called his great DEI. He was diverse. He believed in equity and inclusion, and it was way before its time. That gave us hope, and that had a soothing effect as a layer above all of the things going on in our face at that time.
Preston, we have about a minute. 3 takeaways from his time in the White House.
Well, I would say that his whole idea, quickly, on humanity was a takeaway because it means more than it sounds like, because where the leadership was beginning to dialogue and he articulated was not civil rights but human rights. And so I could expand that. That's surely one of the takeaways. I surely want to acknowledge that in the black community, where he was rooted in a very strong black community in Atlanta, in the King family, he's remembered as a friend of the black community way before that was fashionable. And so all of that, I would say those 2 things are what I consider to be his great legacy, and I remember takeaway from him. I do want to add, however, that I had time with him face to face in 2 instances. I'll make it very quick. One is during the candidacy for mayor with Andrew Young. his library was controversial and almost cost Andrew Young the mayorship because he stood by President Carter. And then secondly, when I was Jesse Jackson's campaign manager, we traveled to Plains, and I got to know him a little better, him and Rosalind.
Wow.
She made great sandwiches.
Oh. Talking with Preston Love Jr. and Randy Adkins about the life of Jimmy Carter, I want to thank you both for being here and sharing your time and expertise, and wish you the very best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. In the words of President Jimmy Carter, when we left the White House, we could have done anything, but our choice was to volunteer as habitat workers, and that's been a life-changing experience for us. Here to talk about the legacy of Jimmy Carter are Habitat for Humanity of Omaha's Amanda Brewer and Mary Lopez. Thank you both so much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You bet. Amanda, I want to start with you. What is Habitat for Humanity?
Habitat for Humanity is an organization that builds and renovates houses in partnership with low-income families. And the reason so many of your viewers have heard of Habitat for Humanity is because of President and Mrs. Carter. They helped put Habitat for Humanity on the map, and I'm so grateful for them.
Wow. Talk about your role with the organization, Amanda.
Yeah, I feel so fortunate. I started as a volunteer with Habitat for Humanity, a full-time volunteer. I moved down to Georgia, and that's how I got to meet President Carter. And then it ended up being my career, so I'm now the CEO of Habitat for Humanity in Omaha.
Oh my goodness, we are going to put up a photo for our viewers. And so as we're doing that, I want you to talk a little bit more about that beginning for you with Habitat.
Yeah, I mean, you can see by the picture, I'm quite a bit younger than I am now. That was 27 years ago. And President Carter was so special. Every Sunday, he taught Sunday school at his home church in Plains, Georgia, and anybody could go. And that was the first time I met him and really learned so much at that time, and made it a goal whenever I had the chance to listen to him speak. And his message was always impressive to me because he had a message that really resonated with anyone who was listening from any background at all. And he has been a true inspiration to me.
What do you remember most about that encounter? I mean, as you look back and realize the significance of that, right? What is your takeaway?
It's so funny because, yeah, significance, you're meeting a former president, it's a big deal. And the takeaway, though, is that he was a regular person with an incredible amount of power and influence, but he didn't show up that way. He wanted to be relatable, and he wanted to use that power and influence for good. And I think that's the lesson that so many people have taken from him and why he has been such an inspiration.
Okay, before we go to our next guest here, I want you to talk about, briefly, volunteers at Habitat and how important they are.
Yeah, volunteers are the lifeblood of Habitat for Humanity, and President Carter realized that when he got involved in the organization in 1984. He saw the need, he saw the positive impact of homeownership, and soon after he started every year the Carter Work Project, where a week volunteers from all over the world would get together and build a whole bunch of houses in 1 week. And we've had a lot of people from Omaha and Nebraska participate in those projects, and Mary is one of them. And I'm so excited for your viewers to hear her story.
What a great segue. Mary, that was very nice. So you are a volunteer for Habitat. How long have you been a volunteer?
Oh gosh, Amanda.
Decades.
Way before the Carter Work Project, I have a little group of women that has grown and grown and grown through the years that we do local builds, and it's the same inspiration. We're inspired by the homeowners who are part of our teams, and also the staff and other volunteers for Habitat Omaha.
Mary, there is so much opportunity in terms of volunteering these days. Why Habitat for you?
You know, I think if we haven't learned anything else this week with all the wildfires and people who are of substantial means but were left with nothing, that housing is really important. I mean, it's one of those basic things that people need. And when you lose your housing, or your housing is substandard, it really cuts into the core of a person's life and their ability to do everything else in their life. And I had been involved years ago as a public housing commissioner and learned a lot about housing, and especially housing for people who were in need financially. And it just one thing led to another. My husband and I were supporters, and the builds are fun. I mean, they're hard work, but they're fun.
One thing leads to another, and you wind up on not one, but two builds with the Carters. Set the stage for the series of photos we're about to see.
Well, I'll start in 2010 when there was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake that just leveled much of Haiti. And over 1.5 million people were left homeless, and over 200,000 people died. When we went in 2011, when the Carters led this build blitz to Haiti in 2011, and then again in 2012, the people you'll see in this picture, these were the types of houses that they were living in, and you can't call them houses. They were basically tents that were made of whatever scrap metal they could find, cardboard, little bits of trees, and plastic tarp. I went in 2011, and then I returned in 2012, and people asked me, why did you go back? Because it was such hard work. And I said, because the job wasn't done. And that was inspiration that I actually got from watching the Carters. So in 2012, I went with an Omaha team, and one of the people on the team was my husband, Rodrigo, who went with me at that time. Our day was basically that we would start the day, get on the bus really early in the morning, we'd go to the work site, and we'd build all day long. Nobody could quit until the Carters said that the day was over, and they worked all day. It was not just a photo op or anything, they actually worked. And when they said it was time to go, then everybody could go, and we would go back to our tent camp, and these are the tents that we slept in. And that previous photo that you saw was of just people eating, and we ate communally, and then in the evenings we would socialize a little bit and then head back to our cots so we could start it all over again the next day. The houses that we built were very simple. They had no running water, they had no cooking facilities. However, they were built, the thing that really impressed me was that they were built with very sturdy materials, so that the families that moved into these houses would be better protected from severe weather. In 2011, my team worked on this house. This was just across the backyard from the Carter house, so we got to see them work every day. And in 2012, I went back, and I was so moved to see that they had painted the house, that there was a little vegetable garden, that the outdoor lavatory facilities had been built, and you could just smell the food cooking from families who were just living and thriving in this neighborhood. The Carters were on site, as I said. They were just across the backyard from us in 2011, and they were very visible to people. And so here's a picture that my husband snapped of me walking along, and got a picture with the president, which is very meaningful to me.
I would imagine, yes.
In the evenings, the Carters would pull us together for what the volunteers called the fireside chats, which is really funny because it was about 100 degrees most of the time. But we'd sit on, just planks and listen to the Carters talk about really the work that they were doing on a humanitarian basis through the Carter Center. And probably the pinnacle of that was we got to do one of the Sunday schools like you talked about, Amanda. And that was really where Jimmy Carter pulled it all together. And we could hear from him just how his really deep faith was what called him to service to other people.
How would you sum up that experience in terms of how it may have changed your life, right? So,
you know, I already was a volunteer. This was such a deep volunteer activity, and it was hard work. But I would say, if I was going to sum it up really succinctly, I would say the Carters were the role models for how to stay dedicated to a cause, how to make it meaningful, and to realize that we're all connected, and we do have an obligation to care for other people.
Wow. Okay, we have less than 2 minutes remaining. I'll start with you, Mary, in terms of how you're going to remember the Carters.
I would remember the Carters. I would remember the humility that both of the Carters have, but also the determination that they had. They were people who had a cause, and they were working for it. And it started in the White House, and it extended clear almost until the end of their lives, that they were dedicated to their cause.
Thank you. Amanda, what about you?
Yeah, when I think of them, I think of the love they had for each other. I think almost 77 years. I think of a life well lived. So they wasted no time. They were serving the country, serving humanity, writing books, doing good work. And we had a celebration of life at Habitat for Humanity for President Carter during his funeral, for all the people that had been touched directly by him or participated on the projects. And it was neat because people ended up talking about him, but also sharing their own stories of their own service. And I think that's how he wants to be remembered, that he made an impact and that people are still doing good in this world because of his inspiration.
Thank you. Talking with Amanda Brewer and Mary Lopez about the legacy of Jimmy Carter. Thank you both so much for being here. We appreciate it. Earlier, we learned about his life from Preston Love Jr. and Randy Adkins. I'd like to thank all of our guests for being here, the students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and all of you for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television in the School of Communication. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call the UNO School of Communication at 402-554-2600 during regular business hours, or send an email to consider.this@unomaha.edu.
Coming up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Faded brass to a full.
You are a maverick. You stand ready to change the world. You are an innovator with bold ideas and a vision for the future. You are determined to turn your dreams into reality. You are a leader committed to making a difference. With Omaha's your campus, you're at the center of it all. Here at UNO, you dare to dream, to innovate, to lead, to shape a brighter future. You are a Maverick.